Alright, hey class, I'm Alex, and we will be refuting the affirmative's claim that the U.S. should remove its military presence from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. The affirmative asserts in their significance claim that the U.S. involvement for the past 30 years has created more problems than the U.S. can solve. However, I assert that the negative effects created by the presence of the U.S. military in the Middle East are outweighed by its contribution made to the propagation of healthy democracy there. First, I'll address their concerns with financial issues. So I'd like to assert that funding for the war is worth more than it costs. So according to the same website where Mehdi found his information, the Watson Institute of Brown University, a quote says, "Today, top holders of U.S. debt are U.S. citizens who can afford to buy it, including via their pension and mutual funds. Loans have also been taken from the Federal Reserve and other U.S. governmental agencies. About 30% of the post 9/11 operations are financed by foreign borrowing. The other 70% for the war on terror come from domestic debt, meaning that the money is not coming directly out of the taxpayer's pocket. Domestic debt is money which the government owes to lenders within the country. So these are people, specifically U.S. citizens who can afford to buy it, as well as large banks and other financial institutions. Funding for war on terror has not been coming from the taxpayers, unlike past U.S. wars. So this means the debt is not on our shoulders as U.S. citizens. The funds directed towards the U.S. military's counterterrorism efforts are also an investment in a future where people around the world enjoy the basic safeties and freedoms that we value so highly as Americans. This brings me to my next point, in which the affirmative addresses the loss of lives and loss of trust from civilians. Freedom comes at a high price, and there is always terrible collateral damage, but building a self-sustaining peaceful nation is worth it in the end. For example, during World War II, America ruined Germany. American bombed the hell out of it. But America's goal is not to crush any sovereign power standing in their way. Their goal is to develop civilized democracy. And Germany is now has the highest GDP of any European nation, according to the International Monetary Fund as of 2018. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, referring to a timeline of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, on May 23, 2005, Afghan President Hamid Karzai and U.S. President George W. Bush issued a joint declaration that pronounces their respective countries strategic partners. The alliance's goal, the agreement says, is to strengthen U.S.-Afghan ties and help ensure Afghans' long-term security, democracy, and prosperity. Now, the loss of civilian trust may cause issues, and there have been one or two. However, most of the issues of civilian interference are non-violent. And as long as the civilians are not violently acting out en masse against U.S. forces, is not a major hindrance to the counterterrorism efforts made by them. Chance will also discuss this argument when he addresses disadvantages of the affirmative proposition. Next, I would like to discuss their inherency argument. So, the affirmative claim is that the U.S. involvement perpetuates terrorist actions in the Middle East. However, I have a quote from CNN.com stating on March 23rd, 2019, so very recently, the coalition of Kurdish and Arab soldiers backed by U.S., British, and French special forces said it defeated ISIS and fully liberated Baghouz in eastern Syria. Syrian democratic forces declared total elimination of so-called caliphate and 100% territorial defeat of ISIS, tweeted Mustafa Bali, head of Syrian Democratic Force press office. My second subpoint is that foreign leaders want the support from U.S. and United Nations troops. For example, after the Iraq War ended in 2011, the U.S. troops were invited back to Iraq by Iraqi President Barham Salih in order to combat ISIS. The President Barham Salih also spoke in an interview a few days after the final ISIS stronghold was defeated in Syria. He said, "There is a general consensus that Iraq needs continued collaboration with the U.S. forces, which he said can go on for as long as it is necessary." This comes from an article in Military Times referencing an interview that the Iraqi president issued. So my last subpoint to defend my inherency claim that the U.S. is preventing current terrorist groups from thriving in these nations is that the U.S. military is doing more than direct combat. They're also training local forces and rebuilding infrastructure in these nations. And so I have a quote from ABC News Network from April 13th, saying that there are 11 United States Agency for International Development and State Department officials overseeing larger teams working on demining, rubble removal, restoring services like water and electricity, rebuilding schools and hospitals. The work will allow residents to return to their homes and stabilize the area from becoming a breeding ground for terrorist groups. So this shows how the U.S. is doing more than just direct combat. They're doing more than taking lives of foreign civilians. The U.S.'s goal is not to destroy every single civilian, every life in this nation. They're trying to eliminate the threat that exists within it, that the world recognizes as a serious threat and is backed by many, many countries. Thank you.